Yeah. So, with the Ragnarök Chronicles book franchise set to take place across the history of the multiverse, I'm going to have stories set in certain years here and there, one of which was a trilogy meant to be in 2020. Now, obviously, things have developed in the actual 2020, which I will, when I come to write that trilogy, need to work out if I want to acknowledge or not. I probably will. I feel like there needs to be at least some kind of acknowledgement of it, because while obviously there's a lot of fantastical things going on in my stories with aliens and so forth, I do try to keep it as grounded in the real world as possible, to be as plausible. Actually, this could really be going on behind what is the public perception. But even so, yeah, I think it's going to be the case that after this is all over, we'll have to see how people feel about telling narratives, even if they're not based around the current global situation, are taking place within it, and obviously we'll have to acknowledge the kind of parameters and limitations that everything is currently within. I think I actually mentioned in my live stream, which was marking the self-publication of my book Gift of the Manson, link in the description below, I mentioned in that actually one of those books set in 2020 was already meant to have a disease at some point. We'll see how that goes in the final draft. But come the third book in that trilogy, that's not going to be as much of a problem. Yes, we are still going to have some characters who are on Earth, so you have kind of characters kind of going on their own separate arcs through the book. Others, however, will spend the majority of it out in space. And as part of what they thus undergo out there in the final frontier, they meet a race that we are going to be discussing today. Hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is the channel where I just discuss, usually, some breakdowns of lore from within the various books that I am writing, all making up an interconnected multiverses history. So, yes, this race is called the Vovoocol, as you will be able to see spelt in the description of the video, as ever with any of those kind of spellings. Originally, they were actually called the Vovoocol, but I felt subsequently that that was too similar to the car brand of Volvo, so I, again, added a couple more O's, muddled things around, got to Vovoocol. In general, when it comes to naming races or people or places, whatever in these books, like when I'm naming them more relative to the present, they are much more likely to have some kind of root in mythological words. Again, it's the Ragnarök Chronicles, and I'll then just be kind of tweaking those words and sounds to create something new. But when it comes to the things that I came up with a while ago, a lot earlier in my planning for this series, again, this is something I've been working on basically my entire life, some of those earlier stuff were just like, what sounds can I make that I think work and could be spelt out, and so forth. That's not to say that any of these things with more like purely original names don't have mythological ties. They have then been connected to other stories, it just may not be necessarily in name. But, to, again, the point of this video grounded here. There's actually going to be a number of different alien races met within this third book during the sections set out in space. I think probably at least 6 or 7 off the top of my head right now, to different levels of importance within the story. Some just pass by, others, like the Vovoocol, having a much more major role, all of which are basically exercises in me trying to be creative with the kind of life forms I can come up with. I actually do further down my video schedule, which, because I only do things once a week, will probably mean it's a while away, but down my video schedule I have a video plan talking about how to come up with kind of original alien life forms, as well as thinking about the logistics of evolution and so forth. So I'll get into that. The point is, with these sort of things, I want to try to be as creative as possible while still being able to logistically say, within some semblance of reason for evolution, given their circumstances, why they would have ended up like this, how they are at some kind of advantage in their natural environment with this kind of physiology, etc. There's also just a matter of, because they are completely different alien races, you also want to talk about how the characters can understand each other. Do they learn the language, like over a period of time of interacting with these people, or do they have some kind of translation device, or what is it? I'll use various different excuses and say just with this one, it is a matter of, because the Vovoocol have access to that kind of technology, it's likely just going to be an actual translation device in this case, although we'll probably, when I come to write it, want to just give some further pseudoscience explanation as to how it works, rather than it just being this kind of cheap, oh, they can understand, put this device on, you suddenly understand each other, which ultimately is what it is what's done in a number of places in science fiction. But I want to at least give some kind of explanation for why I just kind of can sidestep this, because I don't want to have to go through the whole of they now learn the language in every single time we meet an alien race, assuming that alien race isn't among those that have already been studying Earth. Because some of them have, some of them learnt our languages. Some also tried to improve them and failed. Keep getting sidetracked. The Vovoocol. When I was coming up with these, my initial kind of want was for them to be something like an aquatic species, or at the same time, obviously, they are spacefaring. Now, in Star Trek Enterprise, which I didn't see until after I came up with the species, you do have the aquatic Xindi, which were kind of, I expect, aquatic creatures that kind of had their ships filled with, I suppose it was water, but whatever fluid that they were then swimming within. While I therefore could have kind of done the same of just flooding their ships fully, I instead actually went a slightly different tack to say it's not water per se, but instead they're suspended within a kind of gel-like substance that they are producing themselves from out of frills around their neck. So they're perpetually producing this kind of gel. Typically, this would then end up in some kind of cuboid larger frame around them, again, that they're kind of suspended within. And then through certain movements, they can have these kind of gel blobs surrounding them move around the space. Alternatively, if they want to kind of be more like familial with the other races that they're going about, and if they're skilled enough to do so, because it would take skill, they can actually have the gel shape itself into more or less the outline of the kind of creature they're talking to. So it would still look weird, but instead you have this Vovoocol creature, rather than being inside a cuboid, inside kind of a suit that, say, when they're interacting with human characters, it'll be a humanoid blob thing surrounding them, like an extra layer of skin. But since, again, we're thinking about these things, if not aquatic in water, still existing this other kind of fluidy substance, you then have for their lower halves simply just two powerful fins, whereas on their torso, instead of having two arms, you have three, you could call them limbs, but they're more just kind of, I guess, like maybe like how you have with bats. Technically their wings are just hands with really long fingers. You have these kind of webbed digits coming out on 3 points around their torso, which can then bend in either direction to act as grabbing. So if something came inside the gel cube, they could curl either way and take a hold of that thing. As for a mouth, that's kind of in the centre around where our neck and head would be. It's kind of just a vertical facing mouth, and when it opens up, rather than having teeth, it instead has a kind of mesh thing that lurches outwards, springs outwards, that's kind of sharp enough that it would dice anything that got caught in the gel above it. And again, because they can kind of manipulate the gel, if something else got sucked into it at any other point, they could create like mini currents inside that would move it above. Again, open the jaws, this kind of mesh thing whips up, slices whatever it is, and then the various tongues come and pull any kind of smaller fragments down into its digestive system. As for eyes, since it doesn't then have kind of a head on its chest, what could be considered the front of it, even though obviously it's going to be slightly different because you've got three limbs around the front, it instead has photosensitive patches here and there. And otherwise for hearing, we can have the vibrations of sound passing through the gel to again come to what would be their equivalent of, eardrums and so forth. All of those, again, just kind of created in the pursuit of something that wasn't necessarily humanoid, per se. No, I'll discuss that more in the How You Come Up With Alien Species video. Right, so if that's what they're like physically, who are they as a people? Well, and again, this is one of those things where because this would be kind of something that's learned over the course of the story, the human characters interact with them as a matter of what counts as spoilers and what doesn't. So whatever, I'm doing this video anyway, we're inherently going to be talking about this stuff, and the book's not going to be coming out for many, many, many years. So whatever, just this shouldn't be massively important. So the whole thing is back generations and generations ago, on their home world. They were not the dominant species, however they were another one that had evolved to be sapient and tool building and so forth. However, this other dominant species, which I won't go into here, they basically took active superiority in the fact that they were more evolved, that they were the ones that had actually the dominant societies and infrastructure across the planet, and it was basically got to the point where they would constantly mock the Vovoocol for being inferior, that they weren't the dominant species, to the point where eventually the Vovoocol were driven off that planet because they couldn't stand to be there any longer. But they also, again, because of this whole inferiority complex that had been instilled upon them, they didn't feel that they would possibly be able to actively fight back against this other dominant race. So once they got out into space and they were travelling around, it basically became their reason for being that they should prove their worthiness in the rest of nature in terms of all the other species that had evolved. Now, again, it had already been drilled into them that they weren't physiologically the best and so forth. So instead, they wanted to achieve a feat which no one else apparently had done. Now, in the video discussing the history of the entities, those energy-based beings that would call themselves gods, and as ever when I mention a video, I'll link that in the description below if you want to check that one out as well. As I mentioned in that one, a faction of them built a kind of a secondary home for themselves in the Alpha Realm, in our kind of universes, called the Olphaine, or as others would come to refer to it as the Citadel, which has since, according to legend, kind of been abandoned. They all who were living there died out. But because it was built by these creatures that, according to their own propaganda, are gods, they control the universe, it's kind of like, you know, the City of El Dorado, whatever it is kind of, if we can find this lost location that was of great mythological importance, then the Vovoocol will be ascended in a academic or scholarly standpoint. Maybe not scholarly, but that they... archaeological? Maybe that's better. That basically, you get the idea that they found this location of immense importance built by the gods that has been lost to everyone else for basically all of history. So that's what they've been doing subsequently throughout each of their generations, just going around trying to map each part of their universe progressively to ultimately try to find this one mythological location. To do so, they have ships. So these spaceships are probably about the size of like submarines. They're really not massive compared to some that you might expect from science fiction. They're each only small, but they all are kind of connected to each other. They use the subspace conduits that I mentioned in a previous video as well to get around and also to communicate with each other over those great distances as a collective effort, again, to study everything. Obviously these ships are then built to kind of house the gel that they exist within, so they can move about within that. This also aids them when it comes to the ships accelerating and decelerating. Because they're surrounded by this viscous fluid, they experience less of those kind of potentially dangerous forces, although of course you still don't want to be stopping instantaneously, as some ships do in other parts of science fiction. As well, to just specifically to do with deceleration, because space isn't a perfect vacuum, there is still other stuff floating about in it. They have also experimented with trying to come up with engines that, again, when they're trying to slow down, they will instead look to suck in any of that kind of debris matter that's around space at certain angles back into the engines themselves, such that, again, affects the momentum of the overall system, so that, again, it can help in any way with the slowing down. Obviously, it'll depend on where they are and how much there is actually around. Neither way, it's not going to be a lot. Again, it's still something they're experimenting with just to see if there's any viability in that method of changing their velocity. Because ships, in general, in space, because there is no up or down, there's no guarantee that ships would kind of, if they were dropping out of subspace, for instance, that they would come near each other, that they would be on the same plane. Like, it's, again, there's no orientation in here. You would have instead that, say, one ship was like this, another could come in like this, or whatever. In those kind of instances, when those ships are then going to be interacting with each other, what they'll do is they'll basically designate one ship as the anchor. This is usually the largest ship, if there is any kind of difference in size there, or if not, what's most important, or they'll just randomly, one of them will opt to be the anchor. And then the others will orient themselves based around that ship, and you basically have this many degrees in the x-axis, this many degrees in the y-axis, the z-axis, so they can use those as reference points of how they need to tilt themselves. Again, it's usually the larger ship that is the anchor, with the smaller ships kind of swiveling themselves around to orient themselves, because the larger your ship is, the greater you're potentially going to be experiencing inertia, which could be hazardous if you're doing it poorly. So again, it's less hazardous for a smaller ship, or it's easier for a smaller ship to spin themselves around on the big one. Now, as I say, they've taken these ships, gone around their region of space, or spreading out their region of space, trying to find the Citadel. Now, by the time we get to the events of the book that I'm referring to, some of them will admit that some of their ancestors maybe went a bit far in trying to make sure that not only that they found the Citadel, but they were the ones who found it first. These specific mechanisms by which they potentially tried to prevent other races from getting there, I will actually leave that for the book itself. So they say their ancestors may have gone a bit far in some cases, but they're surely fine, the same. Again, we'll have to see to what length they're still prepared to, because again, this is generations now separated from their homeworld, from the disgrace that their ancestors experienced. How much do they really still care about proving themselves? How ingrained is it into their society, to their cultural consciousness? Well, speaking of what's ingrained into the cultural consciousness, you may regardless find, even if they aren't necessarily doing the same things as their ancestors, that their tactics aren't necessarily what you would, or we would as humans, describe as right versus wrong, what is just and unjust. But in a conversation with another one of the races that they come across, another sapient one in this case, they aren't all sapient, when discussing the Vovoocol, there is kind of that comment of each race that is able to conceive of morality, of right and wrong, is not necessarily going to have those same definitions of what is right and what is wrong. If they were to even want to try to convince the Vovoocol that what they were doing was wrong, and that this, what is good and right by human definitions, is what they should consider as right as well, you'd basically have to instigate an upheaval of their entire culture, of everything that they've built themselves around. And even if that was possible, what right would the human characters have to say that their morality is the correct one? Of course, we in our society, as we've built it, our justifications of morality and right and wrong, well, I guess those are internal arguments to have, but I think it's fair to say within our world, what common sense and decency should tell us is right is right. Again, this is not a conversation I want to have. You get what I'm saying. It's all subjective, depending on where you are, who you are, where you've come from. Although, obviously, when it comes down to it, there are certain things that you should expect to be able to be accepted as definitely right for the common good, and things that are definitely wrong. And with that, that's probably actually all that I'm going to discuss on the Vovoocol today. I will leave the rest to be discovered in the book when it is eventually down the line written, unless I do end up talking about them again in a different video. I don't know. But either way, yes. Hopefully you have found that interesting, kind of how a different kind of civilization can be built up, both biologically, in terms of what they actually are, and in terms of what they do as a culture, as a society. Again, hopefully you found this interesting. You'll find other videos on the channel interesting as well. There are playlists so that you can check if there are specific kinds of videos you want to check out, whether it's book overviews or science stuff or characters and races, whatever. Either way, check those out. And until I see you again, just remember to keep on telling stories.